The RTX 2060 is currently the cheapest RTX graphics card on the used market right now, but does this make it a good budget GPU, or will it fall flat on its face? Well, there's only one way to find out, and that's to benchmark it, which is what we've done. This is my friend's 2060, he needed it cleaning, and I thought, while I'm doing that, I may as well benchmark it here on the channel, as it's pretty decent content, and it's also a good stress test to make sure this GPU is working properly. But it's in full working order right now, so we can test it, and that's what we've done at both 1080p and 1440p, with all testing being done in our Ryzen 9 7900X testing PC. By the way, all of the specs are listed in the description below with my Amazon affiliate links. Anyways, back to the RTX 2060, we've tested using driver 576.88. I'm starting to remember these driver versions now, so there's progress here. Anyways, the 2060 has been left at its stock out of the box settings, so let's see how it gets on. Starting off the benchmarks today with Cyberpunk 2077 on the high preset, and to be fair, 1080p performance is perfectly fine. We're getting 69 FPS on average, very nice, with a 1% low of 55, which means the frame times are very smooth at full HD. If we go up to 1440p, we will go below 60 FPS on average, well, far below that, down to 43 FPS, but the 1% low is also looking pretty good here as well. So what I'll do is just enable DLSS, and then that'll get you back above 60 FPS, so that's a benefit of using an RTX card. Star Wars Jedi Survivor gives 8GB graphics cards a run for their money, so a 6GB one is going to be a bit close, I'd like to say. Anyways, we're getting around 61 FPS at 1080p, and for the 1% lows there, we're getting around 42, which is not particularly the worst performance in Jedi Survivor. The frame times in this game aren't really that great. And then switching up to Quad HD, we get below 40 FPS on average with a 1% low of 32. So the frame time is still holding up at the high resolution, but one thing I did note while testing was the textures just weren't rendering in properly, and the game just looked absolutely terrible, like a PS2 game. So a 6GB card isn't going to cut it in this title, especially at Quad HD, but you could always enable DLSS here as well, which works perfectly fine. God of War Ragnarok at 1080p with the medium preset gets on very decently. 67 FPS on average with a 1% low of 55 means the game's running quite smoothly, and the frame times are, well, within line. And then when we go up to 1440p, yeah, we do see a bit of a frame drop down to 46 FPS on average, but the 1% lows are really holding up at 42 FPS. So across both resolutions, God of War Ragnarok gets on relatively decently, all things considered. And like I've said twice in this video before, DLSS is a thing, so you could always get a bit more performance at 1440p. That's always an option for you. Maybe the high preset on Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 was a bridge too far. We don't even get 60 FPS at 1080p, but to be fair, this GPU predates this game by like 7 years, so that's gotta be said there. Anyways, the frame time is looking pretty decent at 1080p, only dropping by like 9 FPS from the average, which is brilliant performance. And even then at 1440p, 39 FPS on average with a 1% low of 33 is still very good, all things considered. And like I've said, it's 4 out of 4. DLSS is an option in this game, so if you need that extra performance, that's always an option. Going into this, I knew the 2060 was going to be a 1080p card, and it was going to struggle at 1440p, which is kind of what we saw. This GPU only has 6GB of VRAM, which is not a lot in 2025. Even 8GB cards are showing quite a few problems now. So when you shave 2GB off, you're going to be running into problems like we did with Star Wars Jedi Survivor at 1440p, as all the textures were like mush. But I guess when you stick to full HD, the performance isn't all too bad, and yes, this is like a £110 graphics card, so you're kind of expecting to make sacrifices here, so you can't deduct too many points from this GPU. As long as you've got a pretty decent CPU, performance in Fortnite on the Performance API is going to be not really hard to achieve, because we're getting just south of 500 FPS on the 2060 with a 1% low of around 262. So if you wanted a high refresh experience at 1080p, the 2060 can do it. Dropping down to 1440p does see a massive reduction in the average frame rate, but we're still getting 291 FPS, which is going to be fine for most gamers out there. And the 1% lows are still looking pretty decent here, so absolutely zero issues in Fortnite with the Performance API. Counter-Strike 2 performed pretty decently on the 2060. There were absolutely zero issues at full HD with 304 FPS on average, and the 1% low at just under half of that at 145. As we've seen from previous benchmarking videos, the average frame rate in Counter-Strike is pretty decent, but the 1% lows are not too great. This continues at 1440p as we're getting around 241 FPS, and the 1% low doesn't go down by all too much, so 1440p might kind of be the sweet spot for this game. And then Rainbow Six Siege at 100% render res is low-key kind of hard to run, because at 1080p we get around 193 FPS, which is not bad, and the frame times are looking pretty decent here as well at 141 frames per second. Going up to 1440p slashes our frame rate quite significantly down to 114 FPS, but the 1% low is also looking very smooth here, so the frame rate's consistent at least, which is kind of important, but I suspect if you're a competitive gamer, you're going to want a bit more performance than this in Rainbow Six Siege. In esports gaming, I can say for sure this is where the 2060 shines, especially at 1080p. We're getting bucket loads of performance, particularly in Fortnite and Counter-Strike, and I'd like to say here you're good enough for a 240Hz experience, but this GPU ultimately overall can provide a pretty solid budget 144Hz experience at 1080p, so if that's what you were getting into, this GPU does it quite fine. If you go up to 1440p, however, you will start to drop some performance, particularly in Rainbow Six Siege and even Fortnite, but even then, you're still pretty much good enough for a high refresh rate experience, especially if you enable like DLSS in Rainbow Six Siege, for instance. The RT Low preset in Cyberpunk isn't necessarily a bad preset, but when you enable DLSS quality at 1080p, it just kind of doesn't make sense. Yes, we're getting 69 FPS, nice, which is also the same frame rate which we got at rasterization, and the frame time is also yet again looking pretty decent here, so VRAM isn't really a issue here, but we are rendering at lower than 1080p, so yeah, that's got to be known. Anyways, when we switch up to 1440p, we get around 41 FPS on average, and the 1% low is still looking pretty decent, so yeah, VRAM isn't really an issue on the RT Low preset, but it's not a very transformative ray tracing experience, and you're better off just sticking to rasterization. Ray tracing is certainly a no-go in Star Wars Jedi Survivor. It doesn't really change anything for the good, and yeah, the performance does go up, but at the cost of all of your textures. The game just looked extremely muddy, like a PlayStation 2 game. It really does not look that good, and this is a telltale sign of running out of VRAM. As from what we've seen, the 6GB here is not very good. When you go up to 1440p, the average frame rate doesn't look too bad, but yet again, the game isn't being rendered properly, and the 1% lows kind of go down the toilet, so yeah, just stay away from ray tracing in this game. It's really not worth it. Ray tracing wasn't really doable in 2018, and it's still not very doable in 2025 on this graphics card, because it just really isn't a great performance at all, and you've got to make a lot of sacrifices. In Cyberpunk, for the most part, it was pretty fine. There weren't really that many problems. We did have to use upscaling, however, but in Star Wars Jedi Survivor, this is where the big problems are, because we just don't have enough VRAM here, and the textures were completely muddy, and the game was just not being rendered properly either, so yeah, don't enable ray tracing on this GPU. You're not going to be having a fun time. So 1080p as a whole is definitely the preferred resolution for this graphics card. It's certainly still got the raw performance there, as from what we've seen with the rasterization results in particular, and even with the esports games, yeah, they got them pretty decently. More so than that with the 2060. But back to AAA gaming, you will suffer from a compromised experience thanks to the 6GB of frame buffer on this graphics card. You will have to drop the high or even ultra quality texture settings down to like medium, especially in some newer AAA games, and the 2060 won't even start some titles like Indiana Jones, for instance, because of the lack of VRAM. And this problem is exacerbated at 1440p. The high resolution means you're going to be using more VRAM, and when you use more VRAM than what you've got, you run into problems. Like in Star Wars Jedi Survivor, all the textures were very mushy at Quad HD, so yeah, that's not great. And even then, the raw performance, I think, isn't quite there. So if you wanted to play at native Quad HD, the 2060 isn't going to cut it. The only saving grace here is DLSS, where you could just enable that on quality and you will get very similar performance to native 1080p. So that's a big win for this graphics card in my opinion, as it still works well, even when you're not using the transformer model, which I don't recommend using on this because the older tensor cores do result in lower performance compared to newer RTX cards. This might be a video I'm working on soon, so make sure you stay subscribed for that. So the 2060 is great for gamers who want to play 1080p competitive titles, but they also want to throw in a sprinkle of AAA gaming in there as well. This graphics card handles it pretty decently, but ultimately at the end of the day, I do recommend at least an 8GB graphics card. This GPU costs around £110 here in the UK, but for very little more money, you can always get the 2060 Super, which has 8GB of VRAM. It's also far better in my opinion, mainly down to the extra VRAM, but it's also got a much more powerful core as well. Anyways, if you want to see how a GPU with twice the VRAM of the 2060 gets on, you can watch one in this video up here. With that being said, I'll catch you in the next one.